Shadows of the past. Martha Langley had always been a woman of quiet strength. To the folks of Emerson Hollow, she was nothing more than the sweet old lady who ran Langley's Attic, the cozy little thrift store nestled on the corner of Maple Street. It was a humble place, filled with second-hand treasures, vintage trinkets, and shelves, lined with books that smelled of time and memory. To outsiders, she was just Martha, the kind woman who always had a warm smile, a cup of tea, and a listening ear for anyone who stepped into her store. She knew everyone's name, remembered birthdays, and made people feel at home in a way only a grandmother could. But what no one knew, what no one ever suspected, was that Martha Langley was the wife of Joseph Langley, a man whose name had once commanded respect in places far beyond the peaceful town of Emerson Hollow. Joseph Langley had been a Green Beret, a soldier who had served in the most unforgiving places on earth, a man who had seen things that could never be forgotten, done things that could never be spoken of. He had walked through fire and returned home carrying the weight of battles that would never truly end. To Emerson Hollow, Joseph had been a quiet, retired veteran who sat on the porch with a weathered book in his hands and a knowing gaze that spoke of things unspoken. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, people listened. For years, he and Martha had built a peaceful life together. They had raised a family, created a home, and tried to leave the past behind. But Joseph's past had never truly left him. It lingered like a shadow, always present, always watching. When he passed away, the town mourned the loss of a good man, never knowing the full extent of who he had been. And Martha, left alone with her memories, continued to live her life the only way she knew how, with quiet resilience. But trouble had a way of finding even the most unassuming places. The red vultures arrive. For the past few weeks, rumors had started to spread through town, whispers of trouble in neighboring areas, of a group calling themselves the Red Vultures. They weren't just any gang. They were organized, they were ruthless, and they had been moving from town to town like a plague, leaving destruction in their wake. At first, it had been distant. News from other counties, stories of robberies, threats, and vandalism. But soon, it became clear that they were moving closer. And then, one evening, they arrived. The sound of motorcycles roaring through the quiet streets of Emerson Hollow was like a storm approaching, unsettling and unnatural. People stepped back, watching from their porches and shop windows as the gang rolled into town, their leather jackets, tattoos, and hardened expressions a stark contrast to the peaceful community. They were led by Darren Razor Vance, a towering figure with cruel eyes and a permanent sneer. He was a man who thrived on fear, on the power he wielded over others. The Red Vultures followed in his wake, their presence heavy with the promise of violence. They didn't come for pleasantries. They came to take. And their first stop, Langley's Attic, a grandmother's welcome. The bell above the door jingled as the first of them stepped inside, boots heavy against the old wooden floor. Martha, standing behind the counter, looked up from where she had been sorting through a box of donated books. She was small, dressed in her usual cardigan and long skirt, her silver hair pinned neatly in a bun. To the gang, she was nothing more than an old woman running a pointless little shop. They saw frailty. They saw weakness. They didn't see what lay beneath. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Martha said, her voice steady, calm. "Can I help you find something?" Darren Razor Vance grinned, stepping forward as he towered over the counter. He had scars on his knuckles from too many fights and a gun tucked beneath his jacket. "You own this place?" he asked, his voice dripping with amusement. "I do," Martha answered, folding her hands neatly on the counter. Well, Razor chuckled, glancing around at the dusty shelves and second-hand goods. "Seems like a waste of space. What kind of money does an old lady like you make in a place like this?" Martha didn't blink. "Enough." The gang snickered. Another one of them, a burly man with a buzz cut, picked up an old ceramic vase and examined it like a predator toying with its prey. Razor leaned in, his smile widening. Tell you what, Grandma, how about we take a look at your register? You know, just to make sure it's safe. A beat of silence stretched between them. Martha didn't move. Her expression didn't change. And yet, something in the room shifted. For the first time, Razor felt something unexpected. Not fear, not hesitation. Something deeper. A warning. Still, he brushed it off. I think you misunderstand, Martha finally said, her voice as steady as stone. This isn't that kind of store. The gang laughed. Buzzcut stepped closer, rolling his shoulders. Lady, we don't ask twice. Razor tilted his head. Come on now, don't make this hard. And then, a voice from the back. A voice that stopped the red vultures cold. I wouldn't do that if I were you. It was low, almost casual, but there was something in it, something that sent a ripple through the air. From the shadowed doorway, a figure stepped forward. An old man, not frail, not weak. He had broad shoulders, a weathered face, and eyes that held a depth Razor didn't like. Martha turned slightly, her lips curving into a small smile. Boys, she said softly, meet my brother Samuel. The room went silent. Because Samuel Langley, a man Razor had never heard of, moved like a soldier. His steps were controlled. His presence wasn't just there, it was commanding. And in that moment, as Razor met Samuel's gaze, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Doubt. For the first time, he wasn't sure if they were the predators, or if they had just walked into the den of something far more dangerous. The past never sleeps. A heavy silence settled inside Langley's attic. It was the kind of silence that didn't just quiet voices. It suffocated the air, pressing down on the walls like an unseen force. The red vultures had entered this store like kings, expecting the usual routine. Intimidation, fear, control. But instead of a trembling old woman, they found something else. Someone else. Samuel Langley. Razor's eyes locked onto him, trying to place him. The man wasn't particularly young, mid-60s, maybe even older, but there was something wrong about how at ease he looked. He had strong shoulders, a solid stance, and a face that didn't flinch even with 5 armed gangsters standing around him. Samuel wasn't afraid. That alone made him dangerous. Razor had spent years on the streets. He knew that men who didn't show fear were either fools or monsters. And Samuel Langley didn't look like a fool. A memory of violence. Buzzcut, standing closest to Samuel, scoffed. What's this? Grandpa's here to save the day. His voice was mocking, but the laughter in the room had died down. Samuel took another step forward, placing himself between Martha and the gang. He moved deliberately, every motion controlled, the way a soldier does when he's assessing threats. Martha smiled softly behind him. Boys, she said, her voice light. I think you've overstayed your welcome. Buzzcut snorted. And I think. He reached for Samuel's shoulder. A mistake. Samuel moved so fast that Buzzcut didn't even register what happened. One moment, his hand was reaching. The next, his arm was twisted behind his back, his body bent at an impossible angle, and a searing pain shot through his shoulder. Crack! Buzzcut screamed, his knees buckling. The entire gang froze. Samuel held him there, effortlessly restraining him. His grip was calm, precise, not brute force, but controlled dominance. You want to put your hands on someone. Samuel's voice was low. You better know what you're grabbing first. Buzzcut grunted in pain, his face contorted. He tried to break free, but Samuel didn't budge. Razor took a step forward, hand reaching for his belt, but Samuel's eyes flicked to him in a way that stopped him cold. It was a look Razor had seen before, back when he was younger, back when he had done time inside with men who had served in places no one talked about. It was the look of a killer. Samuel released Buzzcut with a slight push, sending the man stumbling forward. He crashed into a shelf, knocking over a stack of old books. Buzzcut spun around, red-faced, humiliated. "You son of a—" Samuel turned his back to him. It was the ultimate insult. He wasn't worried. Razor's fingers curled into fists. This was not how things were supposed to go. The wolves hesitate. The rest of the red vultures weren't sure what to do. They had roughed up old men before, drunks, store owners, mechanics who got in their way. But this wasn't some shopkeeper begging for mercy. Samuel Langley moved like he had done this before. Razor took a slow breath. This had to end before it got worse. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man," Razor said, keeping his voice steady. "I don't care who you were or what you did before. This is our town now. You either play nice, or we burn this place down." Martha sighed, shaking her head. "Young men always think they run the world." Samuel stepped forward. "You should leave." Razor gritted his teeth. This was slipping out of his control. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his knife, a long, curved switchblade. It gleamed under the dim shop lights. "Not how this works, Grandpa." Razor flicked the blade open. "We don't just leave. You're gonna pay for that." Samuel's eyes flickered to the blade. His expression didn't change. "If you pull a weapon," Samuel said quietly, "you better be ready to use it." The words hung in the air. The rest of the gang took a step forward, closing the circle around Samuel. Martha stood behind the counter, watching calmly. This had happened before. Not exactly this, of course, but things like this. When Joseph had still been alive, men had come into their lives who didn't know what kind of man he was, and she had watched him handle it, just like this. The only difference, now it was Samuel's turn. The storm breaks. Razor lunged. He moved fast, but not fast enough. Samuel sidestepped effortlessly, his arm sweeping out in a blur. The knife twisted in Razor's grip before he even realized what was happening. Suddenly, it wasn't in his hands anymore. It was in Samuel's. Razor stared at his empty hand, stunned. Samuel flipped the knife, catching it by the handle, then tossed it onto the counter beside Martha. "Not a good idea," he said. For the first time, Razor felt a sliver of fear. Buzzcut, still clutching his arm, suddenly wasn't so eager anymore. One of the younger gang members, a wiry kid with a scar on his cheek, took a slow step backward. They weren't winning this, and they knew it. Samuel turned his eyes to the rest of the gang. "Now you can all walk out that door," he said, "or you can keep trying." Silence. Razor's jaw tightened. This was humiliating. He had terrorized towns across the state. People ran when they saw the red vultures coming. But right now, they weren't even in control of a damn thrift store. He exhaled slowly, rage boiling in his chest. "You're gonna regret this," he spat. Samuel didn't blink. "I doubt it." Razor turned sharply, shoving past his own men as he stormed toward the door. His boots thumped heavily against the wooden floor. The gang hesitated for a moment, then followed. One by one, they left. Buzzcut was the last to go, rubbing his wrist. But before he stepped outside, he turned and shot Samuel a final glare. "This isn't over." Samuel didn't even look at him. Buzzcut clenched his jaw, then left. The door slammed shut behind them. Aftermath. The store was quiet again. Martha let out a slow breath, turning toward Samuel. That was unnecessary. Samuel shrugged, running a hand through his graying hair. "They started it." She smirked. "You enjoyed that a little too much." A pause. Then he grinned. "Maybe a little." Martha shook her head. "You're worse than Joseph ever was." Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the door. "They'll be back," he said. Martha nodded. "I know." Samuel exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. His hands had been steady through the whole thing, but now, they felt tight. The fight wasn't over. The red vultures weren't done. And Samuel Langley, old soldier, forgotten warrior, wasn't done either. The reckoning begins. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Emerson Hollow. The town was still, its streets quiet in the way only small towns could be at dusk. But despite the peaceful exterior, an unease had settled over Langley's attic, one that neither Martha nor Samuel could ignore. The red vultures had left, but they hadn't retreated. They were circling, and both of them knew what that meant: a brother's burden. Samuel Langley stood near the window, watching. He didn't fidget. He didn't pace. He simply observed. He had spent years in places where silence meant death, where shadows could hide anything from an ambush to a sniper waiting for his moment. That training never left him. It was ingrained, part of him now, whether he liked it or not. The red vultures weren't done. Not by a long shot. Behind him, Martha quietly locked the front door. She had been calm throughout the entire ordeal, but now, in the safety of the shop, her fingers trembled slightly as they turned the deadbolt. Samuel noticed. "They'll come back," she said finally. Samuel nodded. "Yeah." Martha sighed, rubbing her temple. "You could have handled that differently." Samuel smirked. "I could have. But you didn't." "Nope." Martha shook her head, giving him a look that was half exasperation, half affection. It was a look she had given Joseph many times before. Samuel didn't say it, but he missed his brother. He missed him more than words could ever capture. And now, standing in this little thrift shop, protecting what Joseph had built with Martha, Samuel felt like he was walking in his brother's footsteps. He wasn't just here to help. He was here to finish what Joseph started. Martha sighed again. "So what do we do now?" Samuel didn't hesitate. "We prepare." The red vultures planned their strike. A few miles outside town, in an abandoned trucking warehouse, Razor Vance was seething. The gang had gathered in their usual spot, a rusted-out building with graffiti-covered walls and a row of motorcycles parked outside like a pack of waiting wolves. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and frustration. Razor sat at a battered wooden table, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface. His jaw was tight, his knuckles still white from gripping his knife earlier. Samuel Langley. That damn old man had humiliated them. No, humiliated him. And Razor wasn't the kind of man to let something like that slide. "You're telling me," Razor growled, "that an old man and his grandma just kicked our asses." Buzzcut, still nursing his injured wrist, shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man, it wasn't just some old guy. That dude knew what he was doing. He fought like a soldier," another gang member muttered. "Like real training. The kind you don't just pick up in street fights." Razor's eyes darkened. He already knew. That's what pissed him off the most. He had seen that kind of movement before. The way Samuel had read their attacks, countered every move before it even landed. That was military discipline. Which meant this wasn't just a random old man standing in their way. He was a problem. And Razor had spent his entire life eliminating problems. The gang sat around the table, waiting for orders. They had been knocking over towns for months, doing as they pleased, taking what they wanted. Emerson Hollow was supposed to be an easy stop. Now it had turned into a challenge. Razor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We're going back," he said, his voice low and sharp. Buzzcut hesitated. "Boss, we're not just going back," Razor interrupted. "We're taking that place apart." His voice dropped even lower. "We'll burn it down if we have to." The room went silent. And then, one by one, the gang nodded. The red vultures were coming. And this time, they weren't leaving empty-handed. A soldier prepares. Back at Langley's attic, Samuel was already getting ready. He wasn't waiting for them. He was anticipating them. He moved through the shop like a man on a mission, scanning the space, calculating entry points, blind spots, and possible cover. His mind was already breaking down scenarios, playing out how this was going to go. Martha watched him for a moment before finally speaking. "You've done this before," she said. Samuel nodded. Yeah, she sighed, rubbing her hands together. I don't like it. You don't have to. But it's happening anyway. Samuel met her gaze. Yes. Martha swallowed, then turned toward the counter. After a brief pause, she reached beneath it, pulling out something that Samuel wasn't expecting. A shotgun. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Where'd you get that? Martha huffed. You think Joseph didn't prepare for this kind of thing? He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Of course he did. Martha checked the shotgun, loading it with the ease of someone who wasn't new to firearms. Samuel watched her carefully. When was the last time you fired one of those? Martha didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the old clock hanging on the wall. About 20 years ago, she admitted. But if they come through that door, I won't hesitate. Samuel believed her. This wasn't just a thrift store to Martha. It was her home. Her life. And no one, not some biker gang, not even Samuel himself, was going to take that from her. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small leather holster. Inside, a .45 caliber pistol. He checked the chamber, then secured the holster at his side. Martha raised an eyebrow. Samuel smirked. You think I was just gonna take on a gang with my bare hands? I wouldn't put it past you, she muttered. Samuel chuckled. Then the power cut out. The store plunged into darkness. Martha froze. Samuel's expression hardened. They're here. The red vultures return. Outside, the roar of motorcycles filled the night. Headlights pierced the darkness, their beams sweeping across the shop's windows like searchlights in a war zone. Samuel stepped to the door, peering through the tiny crack between the blinds. They were surrounding the building. 7. Armed. Leather jackets, steel chains, a couple carrying baseball bats, and Razor, standing at the center, a Molotov cocktail in his hand. Samuel's fingers tightened on his pistol. They're not here to scare us, he murmured. Martha didn't look away from the window. Then what are they here for? Samuel exhaled slowly. They're here to kill us. Outside, Razor raised the glass bottle, his grin shining in the firelight. And then, he lit the match. The fire in the night. The match burned bright, its tiny flame flickering in the night air, dancing against the glass of the Molotov cocktail in Razor Vance's grip. The red vultures stood ready, their motorcycles idling like a pack of hungry wolves, their shadows stretching long across the pavement outside Langley's attic. Inside, Samuel Langley and Martha stood side by side, their breath steady, their hands firm on their weapons. This wasn't just another robbery. It was a war. And wars had winners and losers. Martha swallowed as she watched Razor lift the bottle. They're actually going to do it. Samuel's gaze never wavered. They think fire will scare us. A pause. Then his voice dropped lower. They're wrong. And then, before anyone could react, Samuel moved. The first shot. The world exploded into motion. Samuel didn't hesitate. He fired. The single gunshot shattered the silence, the bullet striking Razor's wrist just as he was about to throw the Molotov. The glass bottle slipped. The flame met gasoline. And suddenly, Razor was on fire. Chaos unleashed. The cocktail exploded at Razor's feet, flames licking up his jeans, his jacket, the heat consuming him in an instant. He let out a scream of rage and agony, dropping to the ground, rolling, trying desperately to put out the fire. His men, his red vultures, stood frozen, the shock of seeing their leader engulfed in flames paralyzing them. Samuel wasn't about to let them recover. He moved like a man possessed, stepping through the front door with silent precision, his pistol raised. Martha was right behind him, shotgun at her shoulder, her expression fierce. "This is your last chance," Samuel called out, his voice carrying through the night. "Get on your bikes. Leave now, or you're next." But fear was a funny thing. It didn't always make men retreat. Sometimes It made them dangerous. Razor, still clutching his scorched arm, lifted his head, his eyes burning with more than just pain. "Kill them," he snarled. And suddenly, the gang was charging forward. The battle begins. The first biker lunged at Samuel, a heavy-set man with a crowbar raised high. Samuel sidestepped, bringing his pistol up smoothly. One clean shot. The man dropped, clutching his knee, his crowbar clattering against the pavement. Martha fired next. The shotgun roared, sending another biker staggering back, his jacket torn from the spread of buckshot. He hit the ground with a grunt, his weapon falling from his grasp. But there were still 5 more. And they were closing in fast. Up close and personal. Samuel knew he didn't have time to reload. So he didn't. Instead, he dropped his gun, ducking just as another biker swung a chain at his head. The chain whipped through empty air, and before the biker could recover, Samuel was already moving. His fist slammed into the man's throat. The biker gagged, stumbling back, his hands flying to his neck. Samuel didn't give him a chance to recover. A swift kick to the ribs sent him sprawling. Nearby, Martha fought like hell. She pumped the shotgun and fired again, forcing the gang to scatter. But one of them, a tattooed man with a knife, slipped through, darting toward her. Samuel saw it. Too far away. Too late. But Martha wasn't helpless. Instead of panicking, she did something unexpected. She threw the shotgun. The heavy weapon slammed into the man's face, breaking his nose in an instant. He reeled backward, howling in pain. Samuel grinned. That was impressive. Martha gave him a look. "You should see what I can do with a frying pan." Then she grabbed a metal rod from a pile of scrap near the shop entrance. The fight wasn't over. The tides turned. The last 3 bikers hesitated. One was still clutching his knee, another was bleeding from Martha's shotgun blast, and the third had just witnessed his leader get set on fire. They had expected an easy win. They had expected fear. Instead, they found a nightmare. Samuel cracked his knuckles. "You really want to do this?" The remaining vultures looked at each other. Then, finally, they turned and ran. Buzzcut was the first to reach his bike, practically throwing himself onto the seat. The others scrambled after him, revving their engines. Even Razor, wounded and burned, staggered toward his motorcycle, glaring at Samuel as he climbed onto his ride. "You're dead, old man," he spat. "You hear me? This isn't over." Samuel tilted his head. "I think it is." Razor's nostrils flared. Then, with a roar of engines, the red vultures peeled out, disappearing into the night. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath. Martha exhaled, slowly lowering the metal rod. Her hands were shaking. Samuel picked up his pistol, brushing off the dirt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Martha let out a shaky laugh. Joseph would have loved this. Samuel chuckled. Yeah, he would have. She looked at him, her eyes softening. "You okay?" Samuel nodded. "I've been through worse." Martha raised an eyebrow. "That's the problem." They stood in the silence, watching the taillights of the gang fade into the distance. But Samuel wasn't relaxed. Something still wasn't right. "They'll be back," he said finally. Martha nodded. "I know." Samuel turned to her, his jaw tightening. "We have to end this." Martha studied him for a moment. Then, she nodded. "All right," she said. "Let's finish it. A fire that won't die." The night was still heavy with smoke. The scent of burned leather and scorched pavement clung to the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of blood. The sound of the red vultures' motorcycles had faded into the distance, but the storm they left behind was far from over. Samuel Langley wasn't fooled. They had retreated, but not for long. Martha, standing beside him, wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. The metal rod she had used to fight off one of the bikers lay at her feet, a dent in its frame from where she had swung it. "They'll be back," she said, her voice quiet. Samuel exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "Yeah." Martha turned to him, studying his face. "What now?" Samuel didn't hesitate. "We prepare. The town reacts." By now, the gunfire and chaos had drawn attention. A few doors down, the lights in nearby houses flickered on. Emerson Hollow wasn't the kind of town where people ignored trouble. It was a place where people watched out for each other. A town where folks stood together. Before long, a small crowd had begun to gather near Langley's attic. Some stood on porches, others crept closer to the shop's parking lot, cautiously peering through the dark. Sheriff Elliot Hayes arrived first. He was an older man, in his late 50s, with deep lines on his face that spoke of too many nights spent worrying about the town. He stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting the belt of his uniform, his hand hovering near his holster. His sharp eyes scanned the scene. The burned patch of pavement, the scattered bullet casings, the broken bodies of those who hadn't made it out before being taken down by Samuel and Martha. And then his gaze landed on Samuel. "You want to tell me what the hell happened here?" Hayes asked. Samuel sighed. "Gang trouble." Hayes scowled, rubbing his temple. "Damn it, Samuel. I thought you were just back in town to visit Martha." "So did I," Samuel admitted. The sheriff's eyes flicked to Martha, then back to the bodies. His frown deepened. "Is anyone dead?" he asked. "No," Samuel said, "but they'll remember this night for a long time." Hayes sighed, glancing at the scattered weapons and wounded bikers who were still groaning in pain. "And the ones who got away." Samuel's jaw tightened. "They'll be back." Hayes exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Of course they will," he muttered. The sheriff wasn't blind. He had been in law enforcement for too many years not to recognize what kind of man Samuel was. He wasn't just some veteran passing through town. Samuel Langley was a trained soldier. And the way he had handled himself tonight, the calm efficiency, the lack of hesitation, it was the kind of thing you saw in men who had lived through hell and come out on the other side. And he knew one thing for certain. If the Red Vultures came back, Samuel wouldn't just defend himself. He would end this war before it even began. A warning given. After ensuring that the injured gang members were taken to the county hospital, under heavy watch, Hayes turned back to Samuel and Martha. "I'll station a deputy nearby," he said. "But let's be honest, you don't need my help, do you?" Samuel gave him a steady look. "You'd only get in the way." Hayes grunted, shaking his head. "I figured as much." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I know you've got a past, Samuel, and I ain't dumb enough to ask you about it. But I will say this." He fixed Samuel with a sharp stare. "I don't want a bloodbath in my town." Samuel didn't blink. "You think I do?" Hayes considered him for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed. "I don't know what I think, Langley. Just do me a favor, will ya?" "What's that?" "If you're going to finish this, don't leave a mess." The Red Vultures regroup. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, the Red Vultures were licking their wounds. Razor Vance sat in the front seat of a rusted-out truck, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in one hand, his other arm wrapped in bandages from the burns he had suffered. His face was a mask of rage and humiliation. Samuel Langley. That name was now branded into his mind like a scar. He had never been beaten like this before. Never. Across from him, Buzzcut and two other gang members sat stiffly, waiting for their leader to speak. The tension in the air was thick, filled with unspoken anger. When Razor finally spoke, his voice was low, deadly. "We're going back." Buzzcut hesitated. "Boss, I don't think." Razor's head snapped toward him, his eyes burning with something dangerous. "What did you just say?" Buzzcut swallowed. "I mean, we already got hit bad. That old man, he ain't normal. He fought like some kind of spec ops." Razor slammed the bottle down on the dashboard, glass shattering everywhere. I don't care. He leaned in close, his burned face twisted with fury. I don't care if that old bastard was a damn Green Beret. I don't care if he used to fight wars in the jungle or some desert halfway across the world. His voice was a snarl now. He's just one man. Buzzcut didn't argue. Because when Razor got like this, there was no reasoning with him. There's a way to deal with guys like him, Razor muttered, a cruel grin forming. Buzzcut frowned. And how's that? Razor leaned back, pulling out his phone. We stopped thinking like street punks. His eyes gleamed as he dialed a number. We bring in someone who knows how to hunt men like him. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. A voice, low, gravelly, and cold, spoke on the other end. Yeah. Razor grinned. I got a job for you. A pause. Then, who's the target? Razor's grin widened. His name's Samuel Langley. The war isn't over yet. As Samuel and Martha reinforced their shop, preparing for the next attack, Razor Vance had just put the deadliest piece of the puzzle in place. He had called in a professional. And Samuel Langley. For the first time in years, he might finally be up against someone who knew how to fight like him. The hunter comes to town. The wind howled through the empty streets of Emerson Hollow, rustling the dry leaves scattered along the sidewalks. The town felt different now, like the calm before a storm that had no name. Inside Langley's attic, Samuel sat at the kitchen table in the back room, meticulously cleaning his .45 caliber pistol. His movements were slow, methodical, practiced. Beside him, Martha watched in silence, her hands resting on the old wooden tabletop. They both knew the truth. The red vultures weren't finished. And this time, they weren't just coming with bats and knives. They were bringing a killer, the arrival of a ghost. 70 miles outside Emerson Hollow, on a long stretch of forgotten highway, a black Dodge Charger roared down the road. The driver, Clayton Briggs. Briggs was no ordinary man. He wasn't a thug, a gang member, or a petty criminal. He was a problem solver. The kind of man you called when you didn't just want someone hurt, you wanted them erased. He had no gang affiliations, no loyalty to any flag. He worked for the highest bidder, and right now, Razor Vance had deep enough pockets to buy himself a ghost. Briggs had been in South America, working a job for a cartel when Razor's call had come through. Normally, he wouldn't bother with small-town nonsense, but the challenge intrigued him. A former Green Beret. That was worth his time. So he came. The Dodge Charger rolled into Emerson Hollow just before dawn, its headlights casting long shadows over the quiet streets. Briggs pulled into a rundown gas station, stepping out with the calm precision of a man who had never been afraid of anything in his life. Tall, muscular, dressed in black cargo pants and a tactical jacket, his arms covered in faded military tattoos, Briggs looked like a soldier who had never quite left the battlefield. And in many ways, he never had. He lit a cigarette, taking a slow drag before pulling out his phone. One message. Razor. Target confirmed. I want him gone by tomorrow. Briggs exhaled smoke, cracking his knuckles. This wouldn't take long. Samuel's plan. Back at Langley's attic, Samuel stood at the counter, reloading a second magazine with steady hands. Martha was making coffee, the scent filling the air between them. I assume you have a plan, she said, not looking up. Samuel chuckled. Depends on your definition of a plan. Martha sighed. Samuel. He smirked. I know what I'm doing, Martha. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. Do you? Samuel met her gaze. I spent 15 years hunting men like this. He slid the magazine into place with a soft click. I know exactly what kind of man they're sending. Martha frowned. And that means I need to make the first move. She raised an eyebrow. You're going after them. Samuel didn't answer. He just finished his preparations, adjusting the shoulder holster beneath his jacket before grabbing the keys to his truck. Martha sighed. You were always like this, just like Joseph. Samuel hesitated at the mention of his brother. Then, finally, he spoke. Joseph and I were different, Martha. His voice was quiet now. He was the kind one. He built a life here. He walked away from the war. He turned toward the door. I never did. Then he was gone. The hunt begins. 4:00 a.m. Clayton Briggs sat in his car outside a motel on the edge of town, watching the dimly lit streets through the windshield. He had already done his research. Samuel Langley, former Green Beret, served multiple tours, trained in counterterrorism and covered ops. Left the military at 45, dropped off the radar for the past 15 years. That meant one thing. He hadn't gotten soft. Most ex-military guys who lived quiet lives for too long lost their edge. Briggs wasn't betting on that here. He exhaled smoke, checking his silenced pistol before stepping out of the car. If Langley was as good as Razor claimed, this wasn't going to be a simple hit. This was going to be a hunt. And Briggs loved a good hunt. A ghost in the dark. Samuel moved like a shadow through the woods outside Emerson Hollow, his footsteps silent against the damp earth. He had spent years doing this exact thing in enemy territory, tracking men who thought they were the hunters, until they weren't. He had been watching since sunset, waiting for them to show their hand. And now, he was tracking Briggs. Most men, even experienced ones, would have made a mistake by now. A boot print in the mud, a broken branch, a shift in the wind. But Briggs was good. Too good. Samuel narrowed his eyes. That meant he wasn't just dealing with a thug. He was dealing with a professional. And that changed everything. Briggs senses him. Briggs had been a killer for 20 years, but even he wasn't prepared for what happened next. One moment, he was moving through an alleyway behind an abandoned mechanic shop, his senses alert. The next, he felt it. That gut feeling. Like he was being washed. He froze, his fingers tightening around the grip of his pistol. The air was too still. The darkness felt wrong. And then, a whisper. Right behind him. Wrong turn, soldier. Briggs spun. But Samuel was already moving. The first hit slammed into Briggs' ribs, knocking him back into the brick wall. His instinct kicked in. He swung his pistol up. But Samuel was faster. A quick disarm. A twist of the wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. Briggs grunted in pain, stumbling forward. Samuel let him recover. He wanted this man to know what was happening. That was sloppy, Samuel said, voice calm. Razor paid you good money. I expected better. Briggs smirked through the pain, rolling his shoulder. Not bad, old man. Samuel tilted his head. Old man. Briggs' grin widened. Then he attacked. A fight in the dark. They moved like trained killers, neither wasting energy, neither rushing. Briggs swung first, aiming for Samuel's ribs. Samuel sidestepped, countering with a sharp elbow to the jaw. Briggs staggered, but recovered, launching a brutal knee strike toward Samuel's stomach. Samuel blocked it just in time, pivoting into a strike to Briggs' throat. The hit landed. Briggs gasped, stumbling back. But he didn't go down. Instead, he smiled. Well, Briggs exhaled, rubbing his neck. Now I see why Razor was scared. Samuel shrugged. He should be. Briggs grinned. Then let's finish this. They moved at the same time. 2 hunters, 2 killers, and only one was walking away. The final reckoning. The wind howled through the darkened streets of Emerson Hollow, carrying with it the scent of burned leather, gasoline, and blood. The town slept, blissfully unaware, but in the abandoned alley behind an old mechanic shop, a battle raged in silence. Samuel Langley and Clayton Briggs stood opposite each other, 2 men forged in war, 2 hunters who had spent their lives eliminating threats. But tonight, one of them was the prey, and Samuel Langley had no intention of losing. A fight of equals. Briggs wiped the blood from his lip, grinning despite the pain. "Not bad, old man. You're faster than I expected." Samuel didn't reply. He just rolled his shoulders, adjusting his stance. His breath was steady, his focus absolute. Briggs, however, felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. It wasn't rage. It wasn't pride. It was uncertainty. Because no one had ever fought him like this before. He had taken down cartel enforcers, ex-special forces, hardened mercenaries. But Langley was something else. It wasn't just the precision of his strikes. It was the way he moved, not just reacting to attacks, but anticipating them, countering them before they even happened. That meant one thing. Langley had studied him. And Briggs wasn't used to being studied. "You're not just some Green Beret, are you?" Briggs muttered, shifting his stance. Samuel smirked. "You finally figured that out." Briggs exhaled sharply. "You're a ghost." Samuel shrugged. "Something like that." Briggs' grip tightened into fists. It was rare, so rare that he felt this way before a kill. But there it was. Doubt. And doubt got men killed. With a sudden burst of speed, Briggs lunged forward, feinting left before swinging hard with his right. But Samuel had already moved. He pivoted on his heel, catching Briggs' arm mid-motion, twisting it just enough to throw him off balance. And then Samuel struck. A sharp elbow to the ribs, a brutal knee to the gut. Briggs stumbled back, gasping for breath, his vision swimming for half a second. That second was all Samuel needed. In a blur of motion, Samuel gripped Briggs by the collar, pivoted, and slammed him face first into the brick wall. Briggs let out a choked grunt, blood spattering against the cold stone. Samuel stepped back. "You done yet?" Briggs coughed, spitting blood onto the pavement. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered, still catching his breath. Razor had no idea what he was up against, did he? "No," Samuel admitted. Briggs exhaled sharply, leaning against the wall for support. "So, what happens now?" Samuel tilted his head. "That depends." Briggs frowned. "On what?" Samuel stepped closer. His voice was calm, controlled, absolute. "Are you getting back in your car and driving out of this town?" A pause. Briggs wiped his mouth, tasting the iron in his blood. Then he grinned. "Yeah," he admitted. "Yeah, I think I am." He pushed off the wall, shaking off the pain, his body still aching from the brutal exchange. He gave Samuel a knowing look. "This was personal for you," Briggs said. "You're not just defending some old shop, are you?" Samuel's expression darkened. "No." Briggs nodded. "Figured. What happened?" "Family." Samuel's jaw tightened, something like that. Briggs let out a breath. "Well, you won. I don't do revenge jobs. Razor's on his own now." Samuel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Smart." Briggs smirked. "I have my moments." And with that, he turned and walked away. He didn't need to look back. Because he knew Samuel Langley wasn't the kind of man you fought twice. The end of the Red Vultures. Meanwhile, Razor Vance was waiting at the warehouse on the outskirts of town, pacing back and forth. His burns still throbbed, and his pride was in ruins. Briggs would bring him Langley's head. He was sure of it. The Red Vultures would have their revenge. But when the Dodge Charger pulled up, and Briggs stepped out, alone, Razor's stomach twisted. "Where the hell is he?" Razor demanded. Briggs lit a cigarette. "He's still breathing." Razor's eyes darkened with rage. That wasn't the deal. Briggs exhaled, blowing smoke in Razor's face. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "You already lost." Razor reached for his gun, but Briggs moved first. The silencer barely made a sound. One shot, right between Razor's eyes. His body collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Briggs took another drag of his cigarette, glancing at the remaining vultures. "You boys got two choices," he said. Stay and die, or get on your bikes and never look back. The remaining gang members hesitated for half a second. Then they ran. Briggs chuckled. That's what I thought. And with that, he got back in his car and left Emerson Hollow for good. Samuel comes home. Back at Langley's attic, Martha stood at the kitchen counter, pouring 2 cups of coffee. She didn't flinch when Samuel walked in, his jacket dirtied from the fight, his knuckles red from impact. She just set his cup down on the table. "Well?" she asked. Samuel sat down with a tired grunt, taking a sip of his coffee. "It's over." Martha studied him. "For good." Samuel held her gaze. "Yeah." A beat of silence passed. Then, finally, Martha smiled. "Good." She sipped her coffee, letting the warmth settle in her bones. Samuel leaned back in his chair, the exhaustion finally hitting him. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt at peace.